important to introspect over the movement itself, its significant contribution, limitations, and the opportunities of his ideas and the future of the anti-caste movement. In this context, the Conference on Ambedkar Consciousness becomes very important attempt for intellectuals and academicians to reflect upon the changing ideological landscape in India and Ambedkar consciousness. Discussions on consciousness has often been limited to a spiritual and mystical tradition in the history. The idea of consciousness or Chetna has been central to the different diverse religious and the meditative practices. At the same time, substantial body of scholarship has examined social consciousness, selfhood, identity, identification, the embodied self and the cognition of the self, and the recognition of self. Thinkers such as William James, Charles Hutton Cooley, George Herbert Mead have been significant attention to these themes. The concept of experience has likewise been extensively explored across disciplines, particularly in anthropology, in sociology and the psychology. Even Descartes' famous proposition, I think therefore I am, remains the foundational in debates of consciousness and the ways in which individuals derive meaning about self and the society. While discussing the topic reopening of Ambedkar consciousness, I through this lecture aim to deconstruct the idea of social consciousness, the kind of consciousness that existed in India across time and the space, the kind of consciousness that Ambedkar imagined part of an Indian public and probably a global consciousness. I'll have some exposition on how he imagined the methodology. However, I have just briefly touched upon that. To begin with, it would be very useful for us to see what C.H. Cooley in his paper Social Consciousness talks about social consciousness itself. Charles Hutton Cooley, social consciousness referred to the fundamental awareness that mind is at once and the individual at his collective. He argues that there is no separation between individual mind and the social mind. They are phases of the single organic whole, much like unified music of an orchestra composed of multiple instruments. In this view, individuality itself is a social product. Cooley insists that self-consciousness and the social consciousness emerges together. One cannot become aware of oneself without simultaneously become aware of groups, relationships and the interactions that constitute one social world. Social consciousness becomes visible in a process such as public opinion, where many minds contribute to facts, feelings and perspective into a shared stream of thought. This collective reflection enables society to make up its mind, much like an individual does. For Cooley, a fully developed social consciousness leads to a social will, organized, rational and morally guided collective action. Social problems arise not from the inherent weakness but from the lack of coordinated will, knowledge and the moral clarity. Similarly, it is useful to bring Marx into this discussion, particularly the assertion that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. It is well established in the social sciences that individuals are shaped by social, cultural and the material conditions of their lives, and each of these dimensions plays significant role. Their influence varies across time and the space, but the point here is not to prioritize one force over another. Rather, the argument is to affirm the thesis that human beings are shaped by their circumstances, not merely by their individual consciousness. We are products of our everyday experience, our imagination, way of thinking, behavior, culture, language, and even on our own limitations. All these aspects are inseparable from where we live, how we live, and with whom we live. Consequently, the form of social consciousness that arise are unique to specific social context, producing distinctive kind of social consciousness across different societies. In this sense, the consciousnesses cannot be understood apart from what Barbu described as the habitus, the internalized disposition shaped through socialization. The nature of society produces the kind of social consciousness its members can embody. In India, a caste-stratified society, social consciousness is fundamentally shaped by caste. Every individual's consciousness, deeply conditioned by caste, may be described as a caste consciousness. An awareness of one's own caste in relation to the others. It is mode of awareness structured by hierarchical relationships. For upper caste, it manifests as the consciousness of superiority, privilege, and the entitlement. For Dalits, it has historically taken the form of internalized stigma, trauma, and the enforced self-negation. This self-awareness is rooted in the unspoken acceptance of hierarchical positions of different castes, thereby maintaining the status quo. Consequently, multiple castes produces multiple differentiated forms of social consciousness. Each caste arises its own distinct mode of perceiving the world. At experiential level, the consciousness have divergent effects. This graded form of consciousness and their emotional affect reflect what Ambedkar famously described as a system of grade inequality. Drawing from Marx's notion of class in itself, one can argue that each caste in India functions as a quasi-class, though not in strictly economic sense, resulting in what might be called as a caste against caste in themselves. This analogy helps illuminate how caste share structural position, interests, and lived experience within the hierarchical social order. However, the analogy also encounters serious limits. Unlike Marxian classes, castes are not organized around common economic exploitation, but around the ritual status, endogamy, inherited purity pollution codes. The cohesion is thus more cultural and social than economic. More importantly, Marx's transition from class in itself to the class for itself assumes that members of class develop shared consciousness that unite against a common antagonist. Transposing this framework into a caste raises critical contradiction that the caste produces multiple antagonisms, not a single one. Each caste defines itself not merely against upper or dominant group, but also against those immediately above and below it. This graded hierarchy, as Ambedkar argues, prevents very possibility of united collective consciousness emerging organically across caste. Instead, solidarity, the caste order generates fragmentation, rivalry, and the vertical hostility. Thus, the idea of caste could collectively transform into caste against caste system is not straightforward parallel to Marx's class for itself. It requires radical ideological rupture, one that cannot arise from the caste identity, but rather against caste identity. This rupture is what anti-caste consciousness attempts to produce. Yet, anti-caste consciousness also faces inherent limitations. It remains largely individualized because caste identity is a group-based, but anti-caste consciousness challenge to the identity. Its emergence is often solitary, uneven, and sometimes fragile. Unlike caste class consciousness, where workers can organize around the shared material condition, anti-caste consciousness lacks an automatic collective base. The diversity of caste positions from oppressed to oppressors means that individuals come into anti-caste politics with different stakes, motives, and the contradictions. There is no immediate structural incentive for all castes to unite against caste system. Anti-caste consciousness must confront the emotional investment of the people have in the caste. Caste is not only a system of domination, but it is also a system of belonging, symbolic pride, and the inherited caste identity. Dismantling caste requires dismantling this psychological and cultural attachment, which is far more complex than dismantling the material relationships of the production. While caste consciousness is produced and sustained at the level of collectivities, anti-caste consciousness tend to emerge first at the level of individuals. Sociologically, identity gives rise to processes of identification, which then shapes the awareness of consciousness. Caste consciousness therefore derives from one's embedded position within caste identity and the everyday practices that reproduces it. Anti-caste consciousness, by contrast, does not arise from identity, but constitutes a reflexive challenge to identity. It typically appears in individual actors who questions the normative foundation of caste and only subsequently acquires collective form through mobilization of the shared critique. Because anti-caste consciousness originates in individual reflection rather than a pre-given of group identity, it manifests in a multiple and at times fragmented orientation. The aspiration that caste is morally indefensible and must be annihilated remains common across these strands, but the reflexive ground from which individuals critique caste is shaped by their immediate social location. This produces a diverse methodologies and strategies. Different sections oppose the same system, yet distinct intellectual, political, and the religious pathways. Central to these divergences is the unresolved question of reforming or rejecting Hinduism, a tension that sits at the heart of anti-caste politics and the thinking. Within this plurality, I argue that the Ambedkarite consciousness represents a distinct and the more coherent form of anti-caste consciousness, one that offers not only moral critique of the caste, but also a clear methodological, political, and the ethical framework for its annihilation. It produces anti-caste thinking with methodology, a moral and political imagination, a systemic set of processes. While its ultimate aim, like all anti-caste consciousness, is the annihilation of caste, it is distinct in its clarity of method and the vision. Ambedkarite consciousness can be understood through several methodological foundations and the principles derived from Ambedkar's own thought. First, it recognizes caste as a fundamental social evil, a structure that has historically obstructed the progress of individuals, communities, and the nation at large. For India to realize itself is a democratic nation, overcoming caste consciousness is not optional but essential. Caste for Ambedkar is not merely a social hierarchy, it is a barrier to very foundation of the democratic public. It undermines the normative ground on which liberty, equality, and the fraternity can be sustained. Ambedkarite consciousness affirms that caste is simultaneously ideational and the material, that is notional and the material. It is a worldview, a normative order, or set of cultural code, but it is also embedded in the material relation, labor, land, power, and everyday social practices. Moreover, caste is not external to Hinduism, it is structurally foundational to Hindu social philosophy, particularly through doctrines of Varna and the Jati. Its logic has traveled beyond Hinduism, permitting other religions and the region through processes of social interaction, cultural diffusion, and the institutional reproduction. Given this, annihilating caste requires dismantling the power relation that sustain caste privileges subordination. Ambedkarite consciousness insists that caste cannot be destroyed from within Hinduism because being Hindu presupposes the subjection to the minute regulation of Jati and Varna. Hindu social organization is inseparable from caste hierarchy. Therefore, abolition demands the rupture, a decisive break from the religious and the cultural framework that reproduces caste. This is why Ambedkarite consciousness emphasizes the creation of an independent moral, spiritual, and the cultural community that is not tethered to Hindu ideology. It acknowledged earlier historical attempts by Shudras and Ati-Shudras to form autonomous identities. However, those attempts could not achieve radical separation from Hinduism because symbolic and the institutional power of Brahminism remains intact. Ambedkarite consciousness ensures this radical rupture. Crucially, Ambedkarite consciousness seeks equality with Hindu, not equality within Hindu. It rejects reformist approaches that attempt to democratize the caste order from inside. Instead, it calls for a construction of new ethical community grounded in the principles fundamentally incompatible with the caste. Ambedkar located this community-making project in Buddhism, viewing Buddhism as the earliest and the most organized revolt against Brahminical dominance. Thus, the revival of Buddhism through conversion and the building of new social institutions becomes central strategy. The 22 vows constitute a foundational ethical commitment of the Ambedkarite consciousness. They are not merely ritual declaration, but an entry point into the transformative moral, cultural, and the political project. Ambedkarite consciousness begins with the 22 vows, but does not end there. Rather, the vows inaugurate a lifelong process of unlearning caste, reconstruction of the self, and the participating in the creation of new egalitarian community. The vows lay groundwork for the emergence of new collective, an independent moral community composed of the individual from formerly desperate caste who consciously reject caste belief, caste behavior, and the caste practices. In this community, members share a consciousness that caste has no moral, spiritual, or social legitimacy. Behavior reflects this consciousness. No caste markers, no caste pride, and no caste coded conduct. Intermarriage and the interlining becomes normal and not exceptional. Equality is not an abstract claim but a lived thing. Community identity is anchored in social equality, moral dignity, and the fellowship of all people being a part of community. The community therefore becomes a sociological answer to the problem of graded inequality. Ambedkar recognized that Buddhists would initially carry remnants of their former caste identities, an unavoidable consequence of the historical embeddedness. The project of Ambedkar consciousness therefore twofold. Disintegration of the caste consciousness among individuals.
Prashant, wind up in 2 minutes, Prashant. Huh?
Yeah.
2 minutes.
Disintegration of the caste consciousness among individuals who join Buddhism. Second, the reconstitution of new collective identity grounded in the equality and not in the hierarchy. In this sense, the new community is not simply anti-caste. It is anti-dominion. It rejects every hierarchical form, patriarchy, religious authority, metaphysical fatalism, and the cultural supremacy. The equality of all persons across gender, occupation, and the background becomes non-negotiable. The vows marks a decisive departure, as I said, the rupture from Hindu theological structure by rejecting God, soul, Hindu point of view of rebirth and the fate. Human beings, their mind and their capacity become the center of ethical life, as propounded by Buddha. Suffering becomes the key problem of existence, and its elevation becomes a central concept. The moral community envisioned here is not constituted for material gain. Its purpose is self-respect, cultural renewal, spiritual autonomy, and the ethical reconstruction of the ideas. Material, political, economic empowerment remains vital, but are not end in themselves. Instead, they are integral to the sustaining a community founded on the liberty, equality, and fraternity. This project raises three fundamental questions with which I would like to conclude. The first question is how this moral community to be built. How can such community be sustained? And what the dream of this moral community is. Ambedkar's writing suggests clear aspiration to dissolve multiple nations created by caste system and build one nation grounded in shared belief, culture, philosophy, and the ethical practice. A Buddhist nation, not in a territorial sense, but in a moral and sociological sense. This new collectivity would embody what Ambedkar called as a consciousness of kind across his writing, the essential marker of any genuine community. This project is not one of separatism, but of ethical inclusion, an isolation that arises from rejecting hierarchy and not rejecting society itself. And final comment is an Ambedkar's utopian vision the majority of the people, especially oppressed, would embrace Buddhism as a part of American consciousness, as a way for, as a pathway for equality, liberty, and the fraternity. And such shift would create a large culturally empowered Bahujan community, not for cheap electoral gains, but for a common social will to create new culture which is capable of rebalancing the symbolic, cultural, and the spiritual power historically monopolized by the caste elite. I would like to conclude with a simple yet very important question for all of us to reflect upon. To what extent have we succeeded in building such community? What challenges still lie ahead? This is somewhat and something which is very important, and we should continually revisit to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Prashant. Really, it was inspiring and motivational. The analysis given by Dr. Ambedkar in genesis of caste in India, genesis and development, and more importantly, annihilation of caste, you tried to place before us how that is helpful for us so far as social consciousness is concerned. More importantly, posed very important questions which are very important for contemporary India. Thank you very much. We will be there for second round as well. Any question is asked, be ready. Now may I call upon Trinath to present his views on social consciousness and transformation for education and all others. May I call upon Trinath from Karnataka University, Gulbarga.